When Mira Benson pulled into the cracked concrete driveway of her new home, she wasn't looking for a fresh start in the romanticized sense that people often talk about when they escape a bad marriage or a midlife crisis. She wasn't running from something. She was choosing peace after years of working in an industry where aggression was currency and burnout was common. After over a decade working as a contract compliance officer in the insurance litigation sector, where every phrase had to be precise and every misstep could cost a company millions, Mira had learned the value of precision, boundaries, and above all, privacy. She wanted a property where no one could impose on her space, no unsolicited inspections, no mandatory fees for neighborhood signage or holiday-themed mailbox decor. She chose this street in a quiet section of Millbrook Heights, not just because it was outside of any governing homeowners association, but because the records explicitly stated her lot was exempt from all covenants and community oversight. The house itself wasn't remarkable from the outside. Flat-roofed, beige, slightly sun-faded, but Mira saw it differently. It had a full-width porch with brick pillars, large front windows shaded by mature oaks, and a straight stretch of lawn bordered by low box hedges. The kind of house that looked unassuming at first glance but had enough space inside for her work, her books, and the kind of silence she had long craved. More importantly, the property records showed unbroken lot lines and no shared easements or community zoning disputes. It was, in every legal and practical sense, hers and hers alone. The move itself had gone smoothly. She used a small professional team she'd worked with before, people who didn't require constant instruction or hover near your boxes like vultures waiting to criticize. Mira had learned to be polite but firm, courteous enough to avoid conflict, precise enough to leave no room for reinterpretation. After settling in, she filed her change of address with the USPS, updated her contact information with professional clients, and spent her evenings unpacking slowly, box by box, in a methodical rhythm that had always helped her focus. For the first week, nothing seemed unusual. The neighbors were largely absent. Quiet homes, curtains drawn, the occasional sound of a dog bark or a car backing out, but no one approached, and that suited Mira perfectly. The first encounter with Karen happened during Mira's second week in the neighborhood, though it hardly registered as a warning sign at the time. Karen appeared one afternoon while Mira was sweeping her front steps. Short, tanned, and overdressed for 90-degree weather, with sculpted blonde hair and bright white teeth that clashed with her tightly pursed smile. "You must be the new one," she had said, standing halfway on Mira's walkway without waiting to be invited closer. Mira had straightened and nodded politely. "Welcome," Karen had continued, her voice light but carefully modulated like someone reading from a teleprompter. "We're very community-minded around here. People like to keep things uniform. You'll notice that all the mailboxes are in a neat line, 18 feet from the curb exactly." She gestured down the road like she was presenting a real estate brochure. Mira's eyes flicked briefly to her own mailbox, an older wooden post that leaned slightly and sat farther back, right near the porch. It had clearly been there a long time, and Mira hadn't thought much of it. "That one's grandfathered in," Mira had said calmly without a trace of sarcasm. "It's still functional, and my property's not part of the community charter." Karen's smile didn't falter, but her head tilted in the way people do when they're pretending to accept something they fully intend to change later. "Of course. I'm just letting you know. We like things orderly around here." Mira had nodded just once, then turned her attention back to sweeping. She heard Karen pause for a moment before walking away, and for the rest of the day, nothing else happened. It was a week later that Mira received a note in her mailbox. Not a letter, not a formal complaint, but a handwritten card with a floral border that simply read, "Some of us have noticed the mailbox is unusually placed. It could interfere with safety or traffic." Just a thought. Neighbors helping neighbors. Mira stared at it for a long moment before folding it cleanly and placing it in a folder marked Correspondence, Potential Legal. She hadn't planned to move the mailbox. It had been there for decades, according to the property survey. But 2 days later, the local USPS delivery supervisor left a sticky note asking her to consider relocating the mailbox 3 feet forward toward the sidewalk. The reason was simple and practical. Her driveway had a sharp incline, and drivers were reluctant to back down into it during wet seasons. Mira wasn't attached to the original placement, and she appreciated straightforward logistics. She submitted the formal mailbox relocation form, moved the post herself to the exact coordinates outlined by USPS, and documented the change. It was a non-issue, or at least it should have been. 2 days later, a police cruiser idled at her curb. Mira opened the door calmly, dressed in black slacks and a soft linen blouse, her hair tied back neatly. The officer was polite, young, and clearly uncomfortable. He said they had received a complaint from a concerned neighbor that Mira had altered city infrastructure without a permit and that the new mailbox position posed a traffic hazard. "It's a USPS-authorized location," she replied, already holding the signed paperwork in her hand. "Approved by Mr. Dillon, route supervisor for this area." It was requested, not improvised. The officer took the papers, flipped through them awkwardly, then nodded. "You're within your rights, ma'am. Just had to follow up." Mira thanked him, closed the door, and sat back down at her kitchen table where her laptop was open and a case file waited to be reviewed. She logged the encounter in her personal file, saved a backup copy of the police incident summary when it appeared online 2 days later, and began to pay closer attention to Karen. That's when she noticed the pattern. The decorative bushes Karen had planted along their shared lot line weren't as decorative as they seemed. They extended just a bit too far inward, narrowing the already slim green margin between their properties. Her sprinkler head near the eastern corner was slightly damaged, and for 3 mornings in a row, her recycling bin had been turned sideways, spilling its contents across the curb. Minor, ignorable issues by themselves, but taken together, they hinted at something less passive and more deliberate. Mira, who understood the difference between provocation and coincidence, didn't react immediately. She collected. She waited. She remained outwardly neutral. But she also requested a new boundary survey, retained an attorney who specialized in residential encroachment law, and began documenting every anomaly, every misstep, every friendly note and misplaced bag of mulch dumped near her hydrangeas. She had lived in high-pressure environments. She had dealt with corporate disputes worth millions. What Karen hadn't realized yet was that Mira didn't flinch from confrontation. She simply waited until the weight of the facts became too heavy for anyone to ignore. What had started as a harmless adjustment to a mailbox was about to become a reckoning that none of the quiet neighbors on that prim little street had ever seen before. And Karen, whether she knew it or not, had already crossed the line. Mira didn't confront Karen right away, nor did she mention the incident with the police officer to anyone else. There was no need to stir the pot without first confirming what was actually brewing. Instead, she observed. It wasn't long before the next move came, and it came with the same calculated subtlety that Karen seemed to prefer. One morning, just before 8 a.m., Mira received a notification from the local city planning department. It was a standard letter, unsigned but official, stating that a neighbor had raised concerns about property line violations and requested a visual inspection. Mira knew this kind of request wasn't binding unless accompanied by a formal complaint, but the fact that it was logged with the city meant one thing. Karen had escalated. Not in person, not through discussion, but bureaucratically and anonymously, using the system the way people like her always did, quietly, manipulatively, behind a curtain of polite concern. What followed over the next several days was a drip feed of pressure, small, legal in appearance, but deeply invasive in practice. An inspector, a short woman with a clipboard and an apologetic expression, appeared at Mira's property 3 days later, asking to confirm the mailbox location and check for potential zoning infractions. She admitted up front that it was likely nothing, just a box-checking exercise to close out a flagged request. Mira, calm and composed, provided copies of her USPS authorization form, before and after photos of the mailbox's location, and a signed receipt from the contractor who had assisted her with the post's relocation. The inspector, to her credit, looked embarrassed to even be there. "You're more organized than most commercial sites I visit," she muttered before thanking Mira and leaving. Still, the letter had achieved its purpose, not in finding wrongdoing, but in reminding Mira that she was being watched. She began to notice that Karen's comings and goings coincided more and more often with her own outdoor routines. Watering plants? Karen was suddenly trimming her hedge, collecting mail. Karen was walking her dog even though she hadn't walked him in weeks. Mira said nothing, but made note of the behavioral pattern, cataloging not just what Karen did, but when, how often, and under what pretext. In isolation, nothing was actionable. But patterns didn't lie, and Mira had built entire compliance cases on less evidence than this. The next pivot came via real estate boundaries. Mira received an envelope not from the city this time, but from a private surveying firm, Landon and Pike, a regional land services company based 2 towns over. The letter stated that a request had been submitted to re-examine property demarcations between 2 adjacent lots due to potential overreach in landscape features and fixed installations. Mira's lot number and street address were listed, though she had never contacted this firm herself. She made 3 phone calls before she found someone who would speak plainly. The survey had been ordered not by a legal authority, but by a private citizen, Karen Thorson, Mira's neighbor, and was not an official reassessment. It was a private mapping request, often used as groundwork for potential lawsuits or code enforcement actions. Mira requested a copy of the report and was told that, as she was not the paying client, she had no right to its contents. That was the moment Mira understood just how far Karen was willing to go. Not through aggression, not through confrontation, but through quiet procedural ambush. If Karen was trying to establish some narrative that Mira's mailbox or yard or fencing infringed on her property, then she was laying groundwork with plausible deniability. Mira responded the only way she knew how, with precision. She contacted her own licensed surveyor, requested a certified boundary analysis using historical and title-based reference points, and forwarded the request through her attorney, who already had a growing file labeled Thorson K. Activity timeline. Mira knew that timing mattered in cases like this. If she waited too long, Karen might claim de facto changes in boundary use. If she reacted too quickly, it could be framed as retaliation. The balance was delicate, and Mira was careful to walk the line as methodically as possible. It was during this period that the damage began. Not major, nothing she could prove outright, but it was there. First, a section of her hedgerow appeared hacked back, not trimmed but sliced at an unnatural angle. Then, the sprinkler head in the northeast quadrant of her lawn was found shattered. Plastic shards spread in a pattern suggesting more than just an accident. One morning, she opened her mailbox and found a sticky, pulped mess of wet newspaper, soaked through as if deliberately submerged before being stuffed inside. Each incident on its own was petty, easily dismissed as weather, coincidence, or the clumsiness of passers-by. But Mira had spent her professional life identifying the difference between error and intent. And this wasn't error. What disturbed her more was the realization that someone, Karen, most likely, had begun influencing the neighborhood narrative. One neighbor, a woman named Tracy who lived diagonally across the street, stopped waving during her morning walks. Another man, 2 doors down, abruptly paused their casual conversations about gardening and never resumed. Mira wasn't naive. She knew that in communities like this, where most people just wanted quiet and predictability, even the suggestion of conflict was enough to make people pick sides, especially if one of those sides had lived there for over a decade, chaired bake, sales, and sent out seasonal updates by email. Karen was playing the long game, and she was turning Mira into the neighborhood's problem child, one whispered insinuation at a time. The true catalyst, however, came not from a note or complaint or even a broken fixture, but from a single, unmistakable action. One Saturday morning, Mira stepped out to examine the far edge of her lawn, where it met Karen's. She had received the completed survey report from her own firm the day before, confirming that Karen's hedge and a decorative stone border beyond it encroached nearly 4 feet into Mira's property. Oh. As she approached the line, Mira noticed something new. A wooden stake with fluorescent orange tape driven firmly into the soil. It was marked with the initials KT and a date, just 3 days prior. It had not been placed by a professional, not listed in any legal boundary documentation, and certainly not approved by Mira. It was a marker, a claim, a visible attempt to redraw a line that was not hers to draw. Mira did not remove the stake immediately. She photographed it from multiple angles, took measurements, and filed an updated record with her attorney. The encroachment was now physical, not implied, not suggested. Karen had moved from complaints to action, and that action involved her crossing into land she did not own, did not lease, and had no rights to occupy. Mira knew what this meant. The time for watching had passed. The legal response had to begin now, with full clarity, documented precision, and a demand for removal, backed by certified boundary analysis and a preemptive cease and desist letter. Karen, in her quiet war of attrition, had made the first actual move on Mira's property. What she didn't know was that Mira was more than prepared to make the last. The letter Mira's attorney sent to Karen was firm but devoid of hostility. It was not a threat, not a demand scrawled in anger or desperation, but a cleanly structured legal notice that informed Karen Thorson she had, in no uncertain terms, encroached upon private property. It included the certified land survey, notarized documentation of the existing boundary lines, photographic evidence of the stake, and a 30-day window to remove any structures or plantings that extended beyond her own lot. A copy was also sent to the City Records Department and filed with the clerk's office. Mira didn't deliver it personally. She didn't need to. The process was unfolding exactly as it should, through the correct channels, under the full weight of property law, and for a few days, everything was still. Karen didn't approach, didn't speak, didn't make eye contact. The silence was not peace. It was calculation. Mira sensed it like pressure building behind drywall. Invisible, quiet, but inevitable. Exactly 9 days after the letter was served, Mira's mailbox was knocked from its post. It wasn't vandalized in a dramatic or careless way. It hadn't been smashed or graffitied. Instead, it was unscrewed at the base, its mounting bolts removed cleanly, and the box laid neatly at the base of the post, as though someone wanted to say, "You can put this back, but I can just as easily remove it again." The implication was precise and unspoken, which was Karen's favorite language. Mira took photos immediately, documented the damage, and called the non-emergency police line to file a formal report. This time, the responding officer took her seriously. He listened, examined the scene, and noted that the removal had required tools and intent. Still, without witnesses or cameras facing the curbside area, it was impossible to identify the culprit. Mira didn't say Karen's name. She didn't need to. The officer left with a copy of the previous complaint records and a file number she could reference if it happened again. Mira installed a motion-activated security light on the post and reattached the mailbox that afternoon. It wasn't a warning. It was a reassertion of position. She wasn't escalating, just reinforcing. Karen, however, didn't interpret it that way. The following weekend, a flyer was distributed to every house on the street. Mira found hers folded under her front doormat. A double-sided newsletter titled Neighborhood Harmony and Safety Concerns. It was unsigned but written in the exact clipped artificial cheer that Mira had heard from Karen's mouth during that first passive introduction. The letter didn't name names, but it discussed recent challenges to community unity, aggressive legal tactics disrupting neighborly tradition, and urged residents to consider whether individualism at the cost of cohesion is truly worth it. It was psychological warfare wrapped in font choices and polite phrasing. Mira knew exactly what it was designed to do. Paint her as the enemy, the outsider, the problem. It was an old tactic, effective on people who prized stability over truth, who would rather maintain surface calm than acknowledge quiet bullying. She didn't respond publicly, didn't reach out to neighbors to explain herself, and certainly didn't stoop to writing her own rebuttal. Instead, she focused inward, preparing for what came next. It arrived quietly. A city code inspector left a door tag requesting an interior yard inspection based on a report of unauthorized construction and potential water diversion. Mira's property had no new construction. She hadn't altered drainage lines or performed any renovations beyond planting a few shrubs and adding mulch to the flower beds. The report was false, but that didn't mean it could be ignored. Mira contacted her attorney again, submitted a formal rebuttal to the inspection request, and included photographs, receipts, and a timeline of her yard maintenance. Her attorney also filed a public records request to uncover who had submitted the complaint. The answer, when it arrived, was predictably familiar. Karen Thorson, citing community concern. Mira began to understand the full scope of the strategy. Karen wasn't trying to win a single argument. She was trying to drown Mira in slow-drip legal and social pressure, to create a perception of conflict so pervasive that Mira would eventually move just to escape the constant friction. But Mira had no intention of folding. She didn't invest in property to retreat from it. She didn't file lawsuits out of impulse. She built cases slowly, methodically, with no wasted motion. The survey report had uncovered something Karen hadn't expected. Her decorative stone retaining wall, which bordered the flower bed she liked to call her heritage garden, wasn't just infringing by inches. It extended 4 feet across Mira's boundary, and the irrigation line feeding it ran through soil that Mira legally owned. Moreover, Mira's yard had recently begun accumulating standing water during light rain, something that hadn't occurred prior to Karen's hedges being expanded. Her attorney requested an environmental drainage review. The findings were significant. Karen's re-landscaped garden had unintentionally rerouted runoff directly into Mira's property, compromising the soil and causing erosion near the porch foundation. What had started as a boundary dispute was now measurable property damage. Mira's next letter was not just a notice of encroachment, but a demand for restoration. It included engineering findings, erosion impact photos, and an invoice for preliminary repair assessments. Karen's response, delivered through her own legal counsel this time, was dismissive. The letter claimed Mira's accusations were speculative, the survey misapplied, and that any damage was consistent with seasonal conditions. The implication was that Mira was fabricating the problem. Karen had upgraded, no longer hiding behind anonymous notes or weaponized neighborly concern. Now she was asserting her position formally, through lawyers, trying to create an illusion of equality in the dispute. Mira didn't flinch. She forwarded the letter to her attorney and proceeded with scheduling the soil remediation. She wasn't waiting for permission to protect her home. The atmosphere on the street changed. Neighbors who had once waved now looked away. Cars slowed as they passed her house, not out of admiration or curiosity, but as though gauging the temperature of a storm they didn't want to get caught in. Karen, meanwhile, had begun walking the border of their properties daily, usually with a clipboard or her phone out, recording nothing in particular but always looking, always documenting. Once, Mira stepped outside as Karen paced near the edge of her lawn. Karen didn't speak, just looked up, locked eyes with Mira, and then calmly turned and walked away. It wasn't a stare of threat. It was worse. It was possession, a look that said, "This is mine. You just haven't admitted it yet." The final escalation came not in paper or speech but in structure. One morning, Mira woke to the sound of labor. Metal tools scraping concrete, low voices exchanging directions. A crew was installing a low iron border fence along the side of Karen's property, running parallel to the hedge but now clearly breaching the official boundary line by at least 2 feet. Mira didn't confront them. She didn't shout or demand they stop. Instead, she documented, time-stamped, and called her attorney. That afternoon, an emergency motion was filed in civil court to request an injunction against further encroachment and demand removal of all physical structures violating property lines. The fence, the garden, the irrigation system, they were all now part of a formal complaint supported by survey data, environmental impact assessments, and a mounting pattern of deliberate territorial overreach. Karen had made the mistake of confusing silence with weakness. What she hadn't realized was that Mira didn't move impulsively. She built her cases the way a sculptor revealed stone, piece by deliberate piece, until all that remained was undeniable. And now, with evidence in hand and legal momentum on her side, Mira was no longer playing defense. She was setting the terms of the battle, and Karen would either retreat or be dismantled, one legal stone at a time. The court's acceptance of Mira's injunction was not just a procedural victory, it was a shift in gravity. For the first time, the issue had been pulled out of the narrow context of neighborhood friction and reclassified as a legal matter with tangible consequences. A judge had reviewed her documentation and agreed that what was happening between the two properties was no longer a matter of opinion or miscommunication, but one of measurable harm and overreach. It was a subtle but powerful turning point, and Mira knew that. What made it more impactful was that the judge ordered a temporary halt on any further construction, landscaping, or alterations within 5 feet of the contested boundary until the issue was resolved through formal mediation. For Karen, this meant she could no longer expand or reinforce her claims through action. For Mira, it was a rare window of calm in what had become a long, tightly coiled storm. But if Mira had expected that ruling to stop Karen entirely, she underestimated the depths of her neighbor's fixation. Mere days after the injunction was issued, Mira returned home from a client consultation to find a city vehicle parked in front of her property, engine idling, orange hazard lights blinking in slow rhythm. 2 workers stood near her driveway, examining something with a tablet and a rangefinder. Mira parked quietly across the street, watching before approaching. She introduced herself calmly, asked what they were doing, and was told they had received a municipal request for a line-of-sight visibility audit due to concerns about the placement of landscaping and fixed structures. In plain terms, someone had submitted a claim that Mira's hedges and mailbox obstructed driver visibility and posed a safety hazard. Mira knew immediately who had submitted the request. Karen, unable to challenge Mira in court without risking financial exposure, was now redirecting her energy into peripheral systems, weaponizing city resources in a death-by-1,000 papers strategy. The irony, of course, was that the hedges hadn't changed in height or width since the day Mira moved in, and the mailbox had been professionally placed within USPS guidelines with visibility standards documented in the approval. Mira, polite but unyielding, handed the city workers copies of her survey, the USPS placement form, and photographs taken by her own inspector. The workers, clearly uncomfortable, apologized, thanked her, and left. But the message was clear. Karen had not been dissuaded by the legal boundary. She was simply changing angles. It was during this moment of rising tension that Mira received an unexpected phone call. Not from her attorney or the city, but from a man named Alan Cresswell, a licensed mediator who had been assigned to the case by the civil court. Alan explained that, per the judge's recommendation, both parties were encouraged to attempt resolution through mediation before the matter escalated to a full trial. Mira agreed without hesitation. She had no interest in prolonged litigation if a practical resolution was possible, but she doubted Karen would approach the session with the same mindset. She was right. The mediation took place in a quiet office suite across town. Neutral territory. Alan was a tall, calm man in his 60s, his demeanor practiced but not cold. He greeted Mira with a measured nod and offered her coffee. Karen arrived precisely on time, escorted by her lawyer, a sleek, aloof woman in her 40s who Mira recognized from a previous zoning case years ago. Karen wore a navy blazer and a silk scarf, her makeup immaculate, her smile brittle. Alan opened the session by reminding everyone that this was not a trial, but a discussion designed to reach voluntary resolution. Mira spoke first. She recounted the timeline clearly, without editorializing. She presented copies of her property deed, survey documents, drainage analysis, and photographic evidence. She emphasized that her goal was not punitive, but corrective. She simply wanted her property boundaries respected and the damage mitigated. Karen listened in silence, one manicured hand resting on a folder she never opened. When her turn came, Karen's tone was smooth, almost pitying. She claimed that any overgrowth or expansion was accidental, that landscaping drifted over time and she hadn't realized the extent of it. She framed herself as a steward of the neighborhood, concerned not just with aesthetics, but with safety and cohesion. Her lawyer attempted to challenge the validity of the survey, citing measurement inconsistencies and non-uniform markers. But Mira's attorney quickly countered with notarized affidavits from the surveyors and backup documentation from county records. The mediator asked Karen if she would agree to remove the structures and restore the property lines to their rightful positions. Karen smiled tightly and said she would consider it, but wanted time to review alternative surveys. Mira's attorney leaned forward and said plainly, "There are no alternatives. There is one legal boundary." The session ended without resolution, but the tone had changed. Karen hadn't come to negotiate. She had come to perform, to reframe the issue as a misunderstanding, to cast Mira as inflexible and unneighborly, and to establish a narrative of shared blame. But the evidence didn't support her. The mediator's expression as he packed his notes was telling. The facts were clear, the overreach was undeniable, and the refusal to acknowledge it was not winning Karen any sympathy. Back at home, Mira found that her driveway had been sprayed with a thin line of grass killer along its edge. Just subtle enough to be ignored by most, but sharp enough to scorch a message into the soil. It was a territorial signature, quiet and venomous. Mira stood there for a moment, not angry, just weary. She photographed it, added the file to her ongoing archive, and watered the edge to dilute the chemical burn. It was petty and cowardly and meaningless in the long term, but it was another move, another sign that Karen was not backing down, no matter how strong Mira's position was becoming. What Karen didn't seem to grasp was that this wasn't a battle of wills anymore. It wasn't about personalities or preferences or pride. It was about provable harm and legal boundaries, and Karen had not only crossed them but refused every opportunity to retreat. Mira wasn't fighting her out of ego. She was defending her home because the law gave her the right to do so. And now that mediation had failed, the case would move forward, into court, into precedent, and into a place where even Karen's carefully crafted facade of respectability could no longer protect her from consequence. The week after mediation failed, Mira began to notice a subtle change in the air, not in the weather, which remained oppressively dry and warm, but in the way the street itself seemed to move. Neighbors began to slow down when driving past her house, their eyes lingering just a moment too long on her front porch, her mailbox, or the edge of her lawn. Joggers altered their routes slightly, no longer waving as they once had, but instead keeping their gaze forward. The social ice that had formed over the last few months had thickened into something colder, more rigid. Mira wasn't surprised. She understood that in neighborhoods like this, suburban enclaves with faux unity and unspoken hierarchies, it didn't take much to become the designated threat. A single neighbor willing to whisper poison into enough ears could render someone invisible in plain sight. Karen had succeeded in shifting the optics. Mira was no longer simply the woman who moved the mailbox. She had become, in the eyes of many, the combative outsider who didn't know how things were usually handled. The problem with perception, however, is that it doesn't change facts. Mira still had every legal document on her side, every boundary line confirmed, every complaint properly filed, and every action meticulously logged. But Karen had pivoted once again, this time abandoning her passive-aggressive charm in favor of more direct, though still technically deniable, attacks. Mira discovered that her trash bins had been tipped over 4 nights in a row, always just before the morning pickup. On one of those occasions, something sharp, shards of broken glass, had been mixed into the recycling, resulting in a sanitation worker cutting his hand. The city issued a citation, and Mira had to submit a formal appeal along with security footage from her side camera to prove she hadn't caused the incident. When she reviewed the footage, she saw a figure approach in the early hours, hooded, moving quickly and dragging the bin toward the curb at an unnatural angle. The video didn't show the face, but the posture, the height, and the movements were unmistakable. Mira didn't submit the footage publicly. She handed it directly to her attorney, who quietly added it to the growing case file. Then came the damage to her landscaping. One morning, Mira found that 3 of her sprinkler heads had been crushed, not broken by wear, not snapped by accident, but intentionally caved inward, as if stomped on or beaten with a hard object. A few days later, a fresh trench appeared along the property line where Karen's irrigation hose used to run, except now the trench extended a full 2 feet into Mira's lawn. Someone had rerouted a pipe through her soil, reburied it hastily, and tried to disguise the path with a dusting of mulch that didn't match anything else on the property. Mira uncovered the piping, photographed everything, and called both her lawyer and the city's code enforcement department. An investigator arrived and surveyed the intrusion, quietly confirming that the irrigation reroute was unauthorized and in violation of both zoning laws and environmental codes. A formal notice was issued to Karen's address, but as always, she denied involvement. Mira kept her responses procedural and tight. She didn't speak to Karen, didn't make eye contact, didn't participate in any public spectacle. Instead, she requested a secondary survey, an erosion control report, and a water flow impact analysis from a private environmental engineering firm. The results were conclusive. Karen's installations were not only damaging Mira's property but altering water retention levels in a way that could threaten her foundation over time. This wasn't neighborly overstepping anymore. It was sustained property damage with measurable cost. Meanwhile, Karen escalated on another front, through social manipulation. Flyers began to appear again, this time distributed under windshield wipers, not just mailboxes. They cited concerns over legal aggression, accused an unnamed resident of compromising community spirit, and called for a block meeting to reaffirm neighborhood standards. Mira wasn't invited, of course. The meeting took place on Karen's front lawn, where folding chairs and iced lemonade gave it a picnic aesthetic, while Karen spoke to a semicircle of mostly retired homeowners about the importance of unity. Mira watched from her upstairs window, not out of paranoia but out of necessity. This was no longer just a property dispute. It had become a reputation war. That same week, Mira received 2 letters. One was from the city, informing her that another anonymous complaint had been submitted regarding suspicious nighttime activity on her property. The other was from the county assessor's office. Her property had been flagged for reassessment due to unregistered modifications. She hadn't made any changes that would trigger such a reassessment, but the process alone could result in hours of inspections, interviews, and paperwork. It was Karen again. Mira was sure of it. A campaign of bureaucratic harassment, perfectly legal on paper, utterly corrosive in practice. The tension peaked when Mira returned home late one evening to find her driveway blocked. A delivery truck, one that hadn't been requested, was sitting at the base of her drive. Engine idling, driver confused. He had a slip for a bulk furniture delivery under Mira's name, paid in cash. Mira hadn't ordered anything. The delivery address and name were correct, but the order wasn't hers. Someone had placed a false order and arranged for a delivery that would obstruct her property access, likely hoping for some kind of explosive reaction. Mira didn't give them one. She refused the shipment, explained the fraud to the driver, and filed a report. She suspected Karen had used a burner email or phone number to place the order. If she couldn't get Mira to move, she would settle for exhausting her one incident at a time. Mira's response was surgical. Her attorney filed a comprehensive civil complaint listing every documented encroachment, every instance of infrastructure sabotage, and every pattern of false reporting. A request was made for compensatory damages and injunctive relief to prevent further interference. In parallel, Mira hired a land use specialist who drafted a forensic report comparing aerial photographs from previous years to current topography, clearly showing how Karen's installations had crept further into Mira's property with each passing season. But Mira didn't stop at the legal. She reached out to the local reporter who had covered property rights cases in the region. Without framing herself as a victim, she provided documents, photographs, and public records of every false complaint made against her. She made it clear this wasn't about personalities. It was about the loopholes people like Karen used to harass others under the guise of civic responsibility. The reporter, intrigued by the extent and paper trail of the conflict, agreed to investigate. Within 2 weeks, an article was published, not naming Karen, but clearly outlining the mechanisms of passive-aggressive land bullying and how municipalities often failed to intervene until damage was done. Karen's demeanor shifted after that. She didn't greet neighbors as often. Her walks became less frequent. The clipped, smug confidence began to fray at the edges. But her actions didn't stop. One morning, Mira found that her garden gate had been unlatched and left swinging in the wind. A few days later, a dead shrub appeared in her yard, dug up and dumped with roots exposed. Each act was subtle, designed to be dismissible, but Mira documented them all. Her case wasn't just about recovering her land anymore. It was about establishing that this was a pattern, a method, a calculated campaign of erosion, social, psychological, and structural. By the time Mira's court date was set, the file her legal team prepared was over 200 pages thick. It included sworn affidavits, surveillance logs, surveyor maps, chemical residue analysis, drone imagery, and expert testimony from both environmental and legal professionals. Karen had spent the last year believing that Mira's silence was weakness. What she hadn't realized was that Mira's silence was strategy. Every step had been recorded. Every move had been anticipated. And now, with the full weight of evidence behind her, Mira was ready to bring the truth into the one space Karen couldn't manipulate with charm or flyers or garden parties. A courtroom, under oath, with the law watching. The courthouse was a dull gray structure tucked between 2 dated government buildings, unremarkable from the outside but dense with procedural weight within. Mira arrived early, dressed not for intimidation, but for clarity. navy jacket, no jewelry, hair pulled back in a clean twist. She had no illusions about the day ahead. Civil court was not dramatic. There would be no shouting matches, no slamming gavels, no grand confessions. But there would be records and facts, and a judge with the authority to draw legal boundaries where social ones had long since failed. Mira was calm, not because she felt certain of victory — certainty was a dangerous indulgence — but because she had nothing left unprepared. Her case wasn't built on emotion or neighborhood drama. It was constructed from documentation, timestamps, photographs, notarized statements, surveys, and licensed expert reports. Karen arrived 20 minutes late. Her lawyer walked ahead, clutching a slim leather binder. Karen followed in a light gray pantsuit, her makeup flawless. Her mouth pulled into the same close-lipped smile she'd worn that first afternoon in front of Mira's house. She glanced at Mira once, not with hostility but with something quieter, calculation. Mira didn't return the look. She simply opened her own binder and waited. The judge, a man in his late 50s with thinning hair and sharp glasses, opened proceedings with the same weary neutrality Mira had come to expect from public officials. He outlined the scope of the hearing: a property line dispute that had escalated into allegations of encroachment, vandalism, and willful damage. Mira's attorney began with a clear, concise timeline, supported by high-resolution aerial imagery. He presented the certified survey, mapping the original boundaries and overlaying them with photographs that showed the progression of Karen's installations year over year. The images left no ambiguity. Karen's hedge, stone border, and irrigation system extended well beyond her lot and into Mira's. He followed this with the environmental engineer's report showing altered drainage patterns and soil destabilization directly attributed to Karen's modifications. Karen's lawyer countered not with competing surveys, because there were none, but with language. She claimed the boundaries were unclear, the damage unintentional, and suggested that the dispute stemmed more from personality conflict than actual harm. She attempted to question the methodology of the survey, suggesting inconsistencies in how private firms defined residential lot divisions. The judge, without raising his voice, asked if they had submitted a certified rebuttal survey. They hadn't. Mira's attorney responded by submitting notarized documentation from the county registrar, confirming that the property boundaries in Mira's survey matched official land records to the inch. When it was Karen's turn to speak directly, her tone was one of weary civility. She described herself as a longtime resident invested in neighborhood integrity. She referred to Mira's aggressive posture and suggested she had felt threatened by the lawsuit and what she described as unwelcome surveillance. But when asked by the judge whether she had ever received written permission to place structures on what Mira's documents now legally confirmed as Mira's land, she paused. Her lawyer jumped in to object to the phrasing, but the judge waved it off and repeated the question. Karen said she had believed it was within her property. Belief, the judge replied, does not overrule survey-confirmed fact. Mira's attorney then submitted a second wave of documentation: reports of vandalism, city citations triggered by false complaints, records of retracted service calls, and the fraudulent delivery order. It was not criminal court, so the burden of proof was not beyond a reasonable doubt, but the pattern was unmistakable. Mira had remained consistent in her approach: every instance followed by evidence, every accusation followed by a record, every escalation followed by a legal channel. Karen's responses had not been measured. They had been reactive, informal, and increasingly spiteful. The judge, after 2 hours of testimony, called a recess. Mira stepped into the hallway and stood by a narrow window, letting the light settle her nerves. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt drained. The burden of always needing to be the rational one, the one with the file, the proof, the restraint, it took its toll. But this was what it meant to hold a line. You didn't yell to defend it. You stood on it until the ground beneath you was recognized as yours. When court resumed, the judge issued his ruling. The boundary survey submitted by Mira was accepted as accurate and binding. Karen was ordered to remove all structures, landscaping, and irrigation installations encroaching on Mira's property within 30 days. She was also instructed to fund erosion control work on Mira's eastern yard and reimburse the environmental assessment fees. Additionally, a restraining condition was issued, barring Karen from submitting further anonymous complaints or inspections against Mira without direct cause and municipal review. The damages awarded weren't vast, just enough to cover costs and legal fees, but the real victory was structural. The line had been redrawn, not in the dirt, not with flags or stakes or hedges, but in law. Karen's lawyer nodded curtly, made no move to appeal on the spot, and requested time to arrange for removal crews. Karen herself said nothing as she exited the courtroom. She passed Mira without looking at her, her steps quick and clipped, her phone already in her hand, searching for some distraction that might let her regain composure. Mira didn't follow. She stayed until the courtroom emptied, collected her documents, and walked out without a sound. Outside, the air felt heavier. The clouds that had loomed all morning finally split, releasing a slow drizzle that speckled the concrete. Mira didn't run for cover. She let the rain hit her face, hands loose at her sides, shoulders finally softening. It was over. Not the neighborhood tension. That would linger for a while. Not the social frost. That might never thaw. But the part that mattered, the part that had threatened her home, her ownership, her right to quiet, that was over. Karen would no longer pace Mira's border with her phone. She would no longer install structures without consequence. She would no longer act with the confident impunity of someone who believed that silence equaled surrender. And the others on the street, those who had watched from a distance, who had whispered and speculated and avoided eye contact, they had seen something, too. They had seen a woman fight without spectacle, without drama, but with precision, patience, and the full, quiet force of the law. The weeks following the court ruling passed in a strange rhythm, a combination of subdued victory and measured detachment. Mira didn't expect a parade or neighborhood gratitude. She didn't expect Karen to apologize or acknowledge defeat. In truth, she didn't expect anything beyond compliance, and that's exactly what she received. Within the 30-day window, a landscaping crew arrived early one weekday morning and began dismantling the offending hedge line. The decorative stone wall was pulled up, piece by piece, its roots long tangled into Mira's soil. The irrigation pipe was removed in segments, revealing a muddy, winding trail beneath the earth. Mira didn't watch from her window. She didn't supervise or gloat. She let the crew do their work in silence, documenting only what was necessary for legal closure. When the yard was clear and the property returned to its rightful shape, she had her surveyor return once more. Not out of paranoia, but completion. The final report confirmed what Mira had already known. Her land was whole again. Karen, true to form, offered no words. She returned to her routines, though more guarded now, more withdrawn. Her walks became irregular. The frequent social gatherings on her lawn disappeared. No more flyers, no more clipped comments or glances at the property line. The silence that followed wasn't reconciliation. It was the acknowledgement of boundary, not just legal, but psychological. The war had not ended in flames or shouting matches. It had ended in paperwork and silence, and that, Mira understood, was more permanent than any performance. Around the neighborhood, subtle shifts occurred. A neighbor who hadn't spoken to Mira in months offered a nod one morning. Another, the older man from 3 doors down, left a bundle of fresh rosemary on her porch with no note. No one spoke directly of the case, of the ruling, of what Karen had done. But things moved. Not quickly, not completely, but slightly. like soil settling after a long storm. Mira focused on rebuilding, not the land, but the quiet. She planted low shrubs along the restored boundary, nothing invasive, just enough to define the space without provoking. She hired a local gardener to lay new mulch, re-level the lawn, and install a subtle drainage system that would redirect future runoff without needing to speak of its cause. She returned to work, full-time now, her energy no longer fractured by conflict or strategy. Her evenings were calm again. Tea on the porch, books opened without distraction, emails answered with the precision she had always taken pride in. The tension that had lived in her shoulders for nearly a year began to unwind. And yet the experience had changed something fundamental. Not hardened her, that would be too simple, but sharpened. She now understood, in a way she hadn't before, that peace wasn't something you moved into. It was something you enforced, maintained, protected. Not through aggression, not through volume, but through the refusal to yield ground that is legally, morally, or quietly yours. One evening, weeks after the crew had finished their removal work, Mira stood at the edge of her lawn near where the stake had once been driven into her soil. The ground was smooth now, even. Her own border shrubs small but clearly inside her rightful line. She didn't think of Karen. She didn't think of the judge, or the complaints, or the bruising wear of paperwork. She thought only of the line itself, not as a wall, not as a weapon, but as a definition. The place where she began, and where others ended. And with that clarity she turned back toward her home. Not because she was retreating, but because she had won. Not just the land, but the space to return to herself.